1.
So good evening, everyone. My name is Atira Mohammed from Institute for Research and Development of Policy, the host for today's forum. So IRDP is an independent and not-for-profit think tank based in Kuala Lumpur who are much driven to produce evidence-based research and lead the conversation on public policy that helps build a more sustainable, equitable, and prosperous Malaysia. Feel free to follow us on Facebook, IRDP Malaysia, to know more on what we are doing. So for tonight, we are honored to have distinguished speakers for this forum, Professor Dr. Jomo Kwame Sundaram, a research advisor at Khazanah Research Institute, and Dr. Carmelo Ferlito, who is a senior fellow at the Institute for Democracy and Economic Affairs, IDEAS, who is also a CEO of Center for Market Education. This forum tonight on Will Printing Money Save Malaysia will be moderated by Professor Hans Genberg, a professor of economics at Asia School of Business. And now, without further ado, I will pass the floor to our honorable moderator, Professor Hans Genberg, to start the session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Atira. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here this evening to moderate this discussion on whether printing money will save Malaysia. Before turning to the speakers, I'd like to say just a few words introducing the topic, the way I think about it. And I would like to ask two questions relative to the title, which is very intriguing. So it's, will printing money save Malaysia? So then I ask myself, save Malaysia from what? And I think that's an issue that we will hopefully get to throughout the evening. And you can ask very separate questions about saving Malaysia from what? It could be saving Malaysia from the economic consequences of the current coronavirus crisis. It could be maybe saving Malaysia from inequality, saving Malaysia from getting stuck in the so-called middle income trap. And then the question is, can printing money do any of these things? Or all of them for that matter. And then the second question is, what does printing money actually mean? It's usually meant in the economics profession that the central bank is financing government spending by issuing debt or buying the debt that the government issues to finance government spending. And that again raises the question: if there is any reason why the central bank should finance government spending by buying up the debt, should it do it in all circumstances, or should it just do it in certain circumstances? I mean, during in historical situations, during wars, for example, that's fairly standard response of central banks. But what about during pandemics like we have now, or more generally during as a general policy strategy? And of course that links up to something that has been sort of buzzing around the economics profession and for that matter the political even more in the United States most recently, something called the modern monetary theory. Which links the printing of money with government budget deficit spending. Now, so that's my introduction, and I would like to turn to our distinguished speakers. They have already been introduced. Dr. Jomo, the research advisor at Khazanah, and Dr. Ferlito, Carmelo Ferlito, who is the CEO of the Center for Market Education here in KL. They have kindly agreed to give some introductory remarks, and then I will then ask some questions. And those of you in the audience who would like to ask questions on the panelists, there is a chat box. Please type in your questions there, and I will try to monitor it and pass them along to the speakers. So without further ado, could I first perhaps ask Dr. Ferlito to give his introductory remarks. You are muted, please.
Okay. But he says I cannot unmute. Okay. Okay.
Yeah, no, it's fine.
Okay, that's fine now. Okay. Thank you, Professor Genberg, and thank you to the organizers for having invited me. It's an honor to be at the presence of such a distinguished panel and to make the acquaintance of such important economists in Malaysia. I feel very little, very small economist in comparison to the people that are sharing the floor with me tonight. I would also like to thank Ideas for having given me the possibility to speak at this forum, in particular to the CEO, Trisha Yeo. I put some note in a presentation, so I will now share my screen. I need the organizer to give me the possibility to share the screen. Otherwise, I can't. Please host. I need to. Yep.
Yeah, we're getting on it.
Okay. Sorry. Okay. Okay, this is my screen. So I will try to tackle the topic actually from the perspective that which the printing of money was announced as a potential measure by the Deputy Minister of Youth last week. So referring to it as technically really in the most strict sense to print notes. And this is my starting point. So I will make first a premise on printing money. And printing money is indeed often presented as an heterodox approach, to be opposed to the mainstream view. And in this sense, it is part of the dichotomy that is presented between heterodoxy and mainstream economics as a conflict between economists that are pro-state intervention and free market economists. But allow me to say that this is a wrong dichotomy. So the difference between heterodoxy and mainstream is much deeper, is more methodological, and what is called the mainstream economic framework can be used both to justify central planning and to justify free market approaches. It was the example during the 1920s, during the so-called socialist economic calculation debate, when Oscar Lange and Abba Lerner argued in favor of socialism, but by using a very mainstream economics approach, the general economic equilibrium framework. And they were opposed in the debate to an heterodox school, that is the Austrian School of Economics, which supported a free market solution, so argue against socialism, but using an heterodox framework. So the difference between mainstream and heterodoxy is much deeper than simply the conflict between free market and state intervention. So under certain perspective, the MMT, as it was described, is not really heterodox economics. It can be also defined as a pro-intervention mainstream economics, if we follow mainstream economics as GEE or the faith in the maximization, following the definitions that were given in example from the right by Derek McCloskey and from the left by Professor Hodgson. So this was a theoretical premise. Now, back to basic. Why, and probably you have read on the paper, I argue against the idea of printing money intended as printing notes. And I think that the essential and basic point is the inverse relation between value and quantity. So the more you have of something, the less you value it. And you all know probably the paradox of value, why water is very useful and it costs nothing, and diamonds that are useless, they cost a lot. So the importance of scarcity in determining value. So I argue that printing money and inject money into the system will give the illusion of richness for a certain period of time, but the additional expenditures that individuals will do with that money will drive prices up. In the best scenario, the increase in prices will offset the additional quantity of money. In the worst scenario, the real value of money will be severely deteriorated, which means, to explain it simply, that the people's purchasing power will be diminished. Everybody will be poorer. We had an experiment in Italy on something similar when we, with the system of the escalator, we linked wages and inflation. It means that automatically wages were increased following the inflation rate during the 70s and the 80s. This drove a double-digit inflation in Italy and eventually a very high interest rate. And let's not forget that high interest rate punish the borrowers. Okay? So everything becomes more expensive for everybody. On the other side, I want also to clarify, because someone, being being a free market economist, someone may think that I embrace the monetarist approach, so Milton Friedman and so on, but this is not the case. So I'm also not an advocate of liquidity creation by lowering the interest rate. My background is closer to the Austrian School of Economics, which believes that artificial manipulation of the interest rate creates very harmful consequences for the economy, not only because it creates inflations, but also because it generates an unsustainable boom, which will turn into an economic crisis. Now, as MMT was mentioned, I will just give a few notes, a few critical notes on it. A very simple definition. According to the MMT, a government that issues its own fiat currency can always fund itself with that currency. And therefore, debt is not important. Inflation can be controlled via taxation. But this is not a new story. If we go back in the history of economic thought, people that know me knows that I have a peculiar interest in the history of economic thought. I taught the subject also for 7 years here in Malaysia. These ideas go back to a conflict between Plato and Aristotle. So go back 2,500 years, where Plato was in favor for government just printing money, while Aristotle was arguing that money should be a sound money, so expressed in with a good that has an intrinsic value. And this idea was later on relaunched also at the beginning of the 20th century by the cartelist movement. So MMT is nothing new under the sun. It has been there for millennia, and it lost the debate over the centuries in economics. Which are the main flaws? I mean, there are many, but just to list the most important ones. First of all, MMT overestimates the importance of unused resources. This is because MMT refers to the Philip curve, according to which there is a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. But the 1970s stagflation demonstrate that it is a monetary policy and not unused resources or slack that determine the path of inflation. Second problem, the overestimation of the revenues that can be done from money creation. MMT argues that the government can raise money by printing money. And a recent paper, later I can also supply the references, show that the maximum revenues that the government can make from printing money is 4% of the GDP, but these revenues will generate a 266% inflation. So the trade-off analysis obviously goes against it. A third and very important is overestimating the fiscal policy over monetary policy. So when the MMT economists are told that printing money will generate high inflation, they say that inflation can be controlled by raising taxes. However, this was a path that was tried by Lyndon Johnson in the 1960s, but inflation persisted. And the USA were able to control inflation only under the rule of Volcker in the Federal Reserve by controlling the money supply, not the interest rate, but directly the aggregate of money. Number 4, MMT economists overestimate the political ability to control inflation. So if inflation can be controlled by raising taxes, who is that government that would raise taxes during a period of high inflation? Obviously, no government, no democratic government at least, will have the courage to implement such a measure. Number 5, there are too few safeguards against the risk of excessive public debt. Let's not forget that high debt drives to higher taxation or higher inflation in the future, putting a cap on the growth potential. Under this perspective, many quote the example of the USA, but let's not forget that the USA have a special privilege that counterbalance the size of their debt. The fact that the US dollar is a global reserve currency. So there is a demand for dollars dictated by the fact that the dollars is used as a global reserve currency. Number 6, MMT advocates interest rate near zero forever. But this is a contradiction with the capitalistic system. So the implementation of MMT would drive toward more extensive government control over the economy, or something like a state-controlled capitalism, as in the Chinese model. Finally, some applications. I think that given these premises, what we should do for Malaysia, what we should aim for Malaysia, and what we should save Malaysia from is saving Malaysia from flat growth, stagnation, and rising poverty. So prosperity has to be our common goal. It's not the time for ideologically driven debates like MMT yes, MMT no, and etc. We all have to pursue a common goal, which is sustainable growth to create prosperity and opportunities for all. So under this perspective, inflation is not the way to go, because inflation makes everybody poorer. But I would also add a geopolitical reflection. So inflation and a weak currency would drive investment away from the country, together with other bad policies that Malaysia is implementing, in example for expatriates. And we have recently observed the signing of the RCEP, which is obviously calling for a strong ASEAN. And a strong ASEAN or a strong Malaysia require monetary stability. We cannot have a geopolitical rising role for ASEAN and for Malaysia with a weak currency. In particular, if ASEAN wants to have an important role in RCEP and not to leave it to China alone. Debt is also not the way to go, because it imposes more taxes or inflation in the future, harming future generations and capping growth. So what to do? And I'm driving myself toward the conclusions. From a monetary perspective, I think we should implement a governance reform, reducing the power of central banks in controlling, in particular, the interest rate. we should not fear deflation, because deflation is a path for restoring purchasing power and investment. And if I have to suggest some monetary reforms, I would argue for one of the two of these two radical reforms that I mentioned here. One is thinking about an ASEAN currency on the model of the euro, but to make it stronger, backed by crypto standard. So backed by the Bitcoin, which would replace gold as a new standard. This is probably a futuristic or science fiction hypothesis, but I think it deserves a reflection. Another, a more adventurous system would be the free banking. So if you want to have a stable monetary system, we should allow for banks to issue their notes and to compete based on the strength of their notes within the same country. From a fiscal perspective, I think in this moment we should study the reintroduction of the GST, but lowering income tax, both on individuals and corporate. And thinking instead about more general policies, I would advocate for liberalization of the GLC's control markets to create more business opportunities, liberalizing labor markets to increase the level of investment and also foreign direct investments. So removing the limitations on foreign workers and expatriates, cut red tapes, and really work more strongly at ASEAN level on a coordinated COVID-19 exit strategy, which include also a strategy for opening international borders, at least to a certain extent. Having also a strong business background, I can tell you that there will be no serious recovery without opening the international borders, at least to business travels. The business mood will remain very conservative as far as we remain confined within our own country. And this is particularly true for small countries like Malaysia, which are more a vocation as business hubs rather than as a market per se. This is very different from Indonesia. You can count on a huge internal market. So conclusions. Let's stop populistic claims like printing money or something of the kind. So if printing money was a solution, we had already solved world poverty. Reality is complex and policies need to be based on a serious analysis of trade-offs. And a serious analysis of trade-offs and complexity force us to implement policy with a very serious humbleness. Over-ambitious policies are often the most harmful because of what Hayek was calling the pretense of knowledge. Politicians and policymakers and economists too are not superhumans, are just humans. And as Roger Koppel mentioned, experts fail too and fail in very big way. So the more decentralized are the decisions, the less the probability of failure. Second point, we should responsibly work together for creating the condition for a sustainable growth path, and sustainable means not determining long-term negative effects and not shifting problems on future generations, like debt and inflation instead too. Crisis times are big occasions for implementing the reforms that have been delayed for so long time, and this occasion in this moment cannot be missed. That's all for my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. There's lots of material in there, and we cannot hope to discuss all of those points. I think it's useful. I still come back to my question in the beginning that we might want to think about in this relation, in this context, namely saving Malaysia from what, and saving Malaysia from long-term stagnation is one thing, but the other question is saving Malaysia from current problems related to the COVID situation, where lots of people are struggling. SMEs are threat. They're in threat of bankruptcy and so on and so forth. And that the question there is there a role for government in this sort of situation? And if there is a role for government, then does monetary policy have a role to play in that policy space? But let me not go on myself. Let me turn it over to Professor Jomo for his take on these issues of money printing, fiscal policy, long-term growth, and taxation. That is everything that we need to worry about to get our economy going.
Hear me now?
Yes.
Yes. Thank you very much, Professor Genberg. And thank you very much for reminding us what this discussion is supposed to be about. Thank you also to the organizers for organizing this event at rather short notice, but I think it is very timely since this whole discussion has an important bearing on the budget for the coming year. I think we owe a debt to the Deputy Minister for raising the issue. Having said that, however, I think it is very important that we be clear that I'm no proponent of modern monetary theory and certainly share some of the criticisms which Dr. Ferlito has articulated. I think what is important for us in this context, however, is really I would encourage all listeners who are interested to actually read Professor Genberg's paper. He has a very short paper on the whole question of helicopter money, which introduces it very nicely, historically, and so on. But one of the important points he makes in that short paper is to remind us of the origins of the term helicopter money as a thought exercise by the late Milton Friedman, arguably the most influential economist of the second half of the 20th century. Having said that, however, I think he's also emphasizes that the recent use of helicopter money is actually quite different. That is the use of increasing money supply to try to get over stagnationist tendencies or contractionary tendencies. And this, I think, is the challenge before us. Now, this kind of view would have been rejected out of hand by many people, especially those influenced by Professor Friedman and his thinking half a century ago when he put forward his ideas. But the world has changed a great deal. And in fact, the original versions of monetarist theory no longer have many adherents. And I think it is very important for us to recognize that. And this was recognized by the OECD economists over a decade ago in their responses to the so-called great financial crisis. To avoid the recession, the so-called Great Recession, from becoming another Great Depression, many of these economies, particularly on both sides of the North Atlantic, but also Japan and so on, undertook what are politely termed unconventional monetary policies, of which the most famous is QE, or quantitative easing. And this, of course, has inspired much of the recent discussions around MMT. For many well-meaning social democrats and others who would like an easy way to get out of the recession caused by COVID-19, it is very attractive to turn to MMT. MMT seems to offer free money, easy money, and so on. And this, I think, Dr. Ferlito reminds us is problematic. However, I would have to disagree with him on some of these his objections to MMT, not because I agree with MMT, but because perhaps I'm a more traditional Keynesian. And I think insofar as the COVID-19 and the policy responses to COVID-19 in much of the world, I would emphasize much of the world, but not the entire world, have involved so-called stay-in-shelter lockdowns. This has fundamentally disrupted economic activity, and we have seen also a great deal of disruption of international communications and international trade, as Dr. Ferlito has reminded us. All this, however, doesn't mean that we can come to the same conclusions. And I think it is important to recognize that in Malaysia, at least, the main response, at least in March and April this year, was really monetary. The monetary package was about 10 times the size of the so-called fiscal package in responding to the crisis. The fact that much of the package was not necessarily well utilized or fully utilized is a different issue. But I think it is important for us not to accept his conclusion that there is an over-reliance on fiscal policy. In fact, I would strongly argue that we have not had appropriate fiscal policy. So for the months before the budget was announced, I was actually very concerned that the credit rating agencies and others were actually very active in warning the finance minister against a bold expansionary budget. This, I think, and I have no regrets about doing so. However, what disappoints me about the present budget is not that it is expansionary. It is not that it is unbalanced and so on, but rather that it is not clear from the budgets, and particularly from the budget allocations, how it is going to address the problems which Professor Genberg reminded us of. I think this is really the key challenge. What we have seen is a bit of creative bookkeeping, to put it politely. Some items which were previously under operating expenditure moved to development expenditure and deemed to be development expenditure, and where the current expenditure or operating expenditure portion was correspondingly reduced to give the appearance of budgetary balance. I think it is important for us to think about fiscal balance in the medium term, and I strongly favor counter-cyclical fiscal policies. But counter-cyclical fiscal policies involve discipline, discipline to undertake taxation, a discipline to actually tax, and also very importantly, a discipline to impose unpopular policies when things are going well. That's the whole point of being counter-cyclical, not being pro-expansionary all the time. And this is the problem which Malaysia has. Ever since the Asian crisis of 97, 98, we have been running greater and greater budget deficits. And the budget and the debt limit has been raised. Now, in and of itself, these limits are arbitrary, and I have no problems with raising the debt limit. The question is, what do you do with the increased debt? And this is where I have a great number of disagreements. Now, the second point in this connection, of course, is the fact that a lot of government debt and the discipline of the fiscal discipline afforded by the parliamentary process over government debt only applies to what was called government debt. It does not apply to government guaranteed debt, which is what much of the public sector has been borrowing. So there has been a great deal of borrowing for so-called government guaranteed debt. Now, some of this is justifiable. Some of this is justifiable because, for example, it involved long-term infrastructure investments. But some of these infrastructural investments were basically jobs for the boys rather than needed. And I have, for example, long criticized the East Coast ECRL, which is not only massively overpriced by 4 to 5 times, according to my friends who became engineers in life, but also, very importantly, involves a great number of abuses intended for political purposes. Let me not get into too much detail on that. So we basically have a situation where the real problem, coming back to the question of what do we do with the money, is really the key question. It's not, and this Professor Genberg addresses when he talks about he talks about the fiscal processes and the importance of the fiscal processes and the importance of targeting. Now, I think there are two elements to be made in relation to this targeting, but I think Dr. Ferlito is correct in one respect, that you have, as a consequence of MMT, very often with very little discipline involved, you have a greater likelihood of what is called turbulence. Now, as the great German physicist Heisenberg reminded us, that when he was writing in 1925 or something like that, there were two big problems: relativity and turbulence. And after that, it was really only turbulence which was left to be explained. But turbulence is extremely difficult to address. And I think many of the problems which Dr. Ferlito identifies as problems due to loose money are really problems of turbulence associated with the breakdown, the impending breakdown, the breakdown and the aftermath of the Bretton Woods system. 1971, when President Richard Nixon withdrew from the Bretton Woods system. I think to reduce it all to a problem of loose money really is really oversimplifies very complex issues, which Dr. Ferlito himself, to be fair, admits these are not simple issues and can simply reducible. Now let me move on to say that I find that the three proposals he makes for what monetary policy should be trying to do, unfortunately fall short of what is needed. We are in a crisis in a sense, partly of our own making, okay? In a double sense of the word. One, and despite being in East Asia, we did not respond quickly enough and appropriately enough to the crisis as it was unfolding. I'm talking now of the COVID-19 crisis. And then there was the coup d'etat in February and March. And after the coup d'etat, we basically have a situation where for about a month or so, 3 weeks to a month, you had disarray. There was no clear policy. Ever since the policy was introduced, and some of those policies were actually good, and I want to commend the government for those policies. I think it is important for us to recognize that unfortunately, we began to have almost total faith in a simple solution of stay-in-shelter lockdowns. So, and this I think is hugely problematic, because as we have seen in Japan, in the Republic of Korea, in Taiwan province of China, in China itself, outside of the 3 provinces around Wuhan city, in Laos, in Kerala, all places which are much poorer than Malaysia, they have been able to contain the contagion by early action and appropriate measures. Now, of course, this basically means comes at a cost, of course, but it also means that it has been that people have been able to carry on, because the stay-in-shelter lockdowns basically deprives the most vulnerable of their livelihoods. So this whole question of livelihoods and ensuring livelihoods is something which is very political, and it has important distributional consequences, as everybody ranging from Donald Trump and in Professor Genberg's paper as well. There's some recognition of this. So we need to recognize that for people, especially the urban poor, it is extremely difficult. And I think it is important for us to recognize, and this is the problem with Professor Genberg's targeting proposal. We have not been able to target very effectively in Malaysia. Part of the reason is because we do not pay very much attention to this nebulous sector called the informal sector. And so, the credit lines which involve the informal sector are hardly those involving banks. And so you need, if you want to improve the purchasing power among those people, you need very, very different measures. And so the estimate now is somewhere between 30 to 40% and probably the poorest 30 to 40% of the urban population has had their livelihoods massively disrupted. Some have been successfully able to actually supplement their incomes with new ways of doing things and so on and so forth. But the vast majority are suffering. So I think the whole question of a stay-in-shelter lockdown is a very serious matter, which is needless to say needs to be addressed and including politically. But the other element, of course, is that when you disrupt economy, and Dr. Ferlito is a businessman as well, it's not easy to just turn on and turn off the business. You need preparation and so on and so forth. And this again, unfortunately, we have not done very much of in Malaysia. Yet another problem, of course, is that there has not been an all-of-government approach. We have not seen the entire government mobilized. For example, I have followed in some detail what has been done in places like Vietnam and Korea, and it really has been very, very effective targeting and effective all-of-government approach. But here it has largely been left to the public health authorities and the Home Affairs Ministry to handle many of the issues. And so the disruption, for example, to education has not been addressed very satisfactorily. Many parents are having very serious problems coping with children being at home all the time, especially in low-cost flats and so on and so forth. And less than 10% of the population actually has access to equipment, which allows them to follow online classes. And so we are actually massively depriving a significant share of our young population of their life chances in very, very fundamental. For many children, particularly the poorest, they depend on the school meals for their main meals and the school meals for the nutritious aspects of their meals. And this too is no longer available as they switch to instant noodles and so on and so forth. So I find that the solutions being offered of reducing the power of the central bank, I too do not favor an independent central bank, but I don't see how that helps us in the present situation. Likewise with the other two proposals, introducing an ASEAN cryptocurrency, you did agree that this is something to be considered for the long run. But this is, in my mind, not a solution. So we really need, and some of the major commitments in the new budget, for example, not only to affirmative action measures, can be seen by any political cynic. You don't really have to be a cynic, actually, as something which is what the Latin American literature used to call macroeconomic populism. Okay, and so you have perhaps 3/5 of the population being taken care of in name, but the vast majority of them will not receive very much from these supposedly ethnic affirmative action measures. And then there's a fairly significant chunk, for example, for research and development. Research and development, and by the time you get on stream with research and development, it will take a long time. I have been lamenting, and I published 2 books about it 2 decades ago, lamenting the neglect of technology policy, but certainly jacking up research and development at this stage is hardly the most important priority. So I think the government got it right in April when it talked about relief and recovery. In Malay, prihatin and penjana. That basic 2 thrusts were basically correct. And we have to see how fiscal policy and monetary policy can contribute to that in the least potentially harmful way. I think it might be best for me to stop here so that we can have more of a debate on many of the issues which Dr. Ferlito raised and you have raised, Professor Genberg, in your paper. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Again, extremely wide-ranging and interesting and important comments. Let me perhaps take a couple of minutes to explain a little bit my where I come from in these issues. I think, first of all, I would say that there's no disagreement between the 3 of us, I would say, and between the economics profession in general, that prosperity cannot be generated by monetary policy. Prosperity depends on technological progress, entrepreneurship, investment in infrastructure, and all those things which are essentially either private sector driven or, to the extent there are government involved, has to do with long-term investment prospects. So I don't think that is an issue. What is more at issue is what to do in the immediate when we are facing what we are facing now, hardships of the SMEs, hardships of individuals. Governments are trying to do their best, hopefully, to relieve some of these hardships, and that costs money. That has to be and that has to be financed. How do you best finance government expenditure if you do agree that those government expenditures are necessary to solve some of the short-run difficulties that the economy has? Is it by taxation? Presumably not. Is it by borrowing? Borrowing from whom? Is it borrowing locally? Is there enough savings by individuals to buy government debt? Are they willing to do so? Borrow internationally, that might be a solution. Or borrow from the central bank. I think one should think about these alternatives as possibilities. So that's, I think, one issue, short run versus long run. And I think the monetary policy comes in because it may have some effects in the short run. The other topic I wanted to just to say something about is the saving the economy versus containing the pandemic, and is there a trade-off? And 2 points. One is from my native Sweden, or in the Nordic countries. There's a very interesting experiment where the Swedish authorities have taken a relatively sort of relaxed approach to lockdowns, and in the hope that that would save the economy from hardship. The Norwegians and the Finnish authorities did the opposite. They prescribed much more stringent lockdowns. And as a consequence, the infections and deaths per capita are much, much smaller in those countries than in Sweden. And the economic consequences are not that different. Why is that? I think it's partly because economic consequences come not only because of government lockdowns, but people are afraid, so they adjust their behavior, and that will itself have economic consequences. And I think that is something we need to think about. What is the appropriate sort of balance in this regard? And finally, I must disagree with both my speakers on central bank independence. I think I think I heard some doubts as to the possibility of politicians getting fiscal policy right. Now, if we, in addition, have a central bank that is also run by politicians, what are the likelihoods that we will get monetary policy right? We might then move to what Dr. Ferlito said we should do away with policymakers in general and turn to the private sector with competing currencies and gold-like systems. I'm afraid historical experiences with such systems are not something that gives us too much, or at least me, give too much confidence. But let's perhaps, there was a question in the chat box to Dr. Ferlito about reducing the power of central banks. And perhaps you could elaborate on that, what you had in mind with that part of the statement.
Okay, so back to monetary policy. Thanks to moderator. Actually, I just want to remark that I agree very much with what Professor Jomo said about lockdown consequences in particular on the most vulnerable part of the population, and it being one of the most vociferous advocates against strict lockdowns since the very beginning, and highly criticized also because of that. And indeed, yesterday was published a study from Denmark analyzing 160, analyzing more or less all the world, in which they found no correlation between the spread of the virus and the lockdown. So the determinants of the spread of the virus have to be looked elsewhere. Having said that, coming back to monetary policy, well, first of all, it's not really true that the historical experiments with competing currencies are so disastrous. And indeed, we lived for centuries with at least a system of gold standard and competing currencies. Think also about the Middle Age. And even when Italy was created, there were not a monopoly of currency emission. When I think about reducing the discretion of central banks, actually I have in mind something quite radical that is advocated only by few economists, which is the market determination of the interest rate. So the non-existence of a reference interest rate like it is now. First of all, I believe that the belief that reducing the interest rate will stimulate the economy is a little bit simplistic, and it is applied everywhere. But I come from an hermeneutical perspective, so the interest rate, like every other price, is a signal. So the consequences of the manipulation of the interest rate will depend very much on how the economic actors will interpret that signal. Secondary, and we don't have the time to explore this, but there are business cycle theories that argue that indeed the interest rate that is dictated by the central bank and not by the market will generate a boom and bust cycle, because it does not necessarily represent the intertemporal structure of individual preferences. So to make it short, what I have in mind is to make the interest rate, like all other prices, determined by the market, rather than having a reference signal dictated by a central authority. So a decentralized system for determining the interest rate.
Right. But then presumably the central bank would instead determine the quantity of money or some such thing.
Well, if we don't go to the radical point of indeed the competing currencies, that would be somehow the middle ground.
Right. Yeah. No. Then we get into the question: is it better to control the quantity of the price? But that's perhaps not get into these relatively too esoteric. Now, what about financing current government spending? Do we agree as a panel here that there is some need for government spending to react to the economic consequences of this COVID-19 pandemic, which I think we agree has been, there's hardship for many sectors of the economy, many individuals, many firms. Should the government intervene and do something, in which case, what should they do? And if it involves spending money, how should where do they get the money from? Anyone?
Well, you should answer that question, because I thought you outlined the issues very well in your note. But basically, I mean, obviously, I'm very strong on the need for government action, for government intervention, and this is perhaps where Dr. Ferlito and I disagree most. But I share many of his concerns about the MMT and abuse, and hence I hesitate to go of MMT, and I agree with him about many of the problems. But I think, as you know, that my position being a more Keynesian position, which is always complicated in such an open economy like Malaysia's, the implication of a Keynesian position basically is that you have you do it until you get back to full employment, basically. Now, the problem, of course, in Malaysia is that we have had full employment for more than 2 decades, and we've continued to run deficits. And so you have a very poor macroeconomic discipline in this country, and the latest budget does not hint at any signs of improvement. I agree with Dr. Ferlito that it is generally unlikely that in a downturn, governments introduce taxes. But I don't see any great difficulty, for example, in having a universal basic income supplement, a temporary one, not a permanent one, but a temporary one could be made available, and then on the one hand, and then at the same time taxing the top 30%, let us say, through the income tax mechanism, so you basically provide that liquidity, which is so badly needed, because we are in a way caught in a liquidity trap. And that's precisely why I'm also open to both either money finance fiscal policy or bond finance fiscal policy. The reason why I hesitate about bond finance fiscal policy is that there is in many countries the option of the central bank buying the government bonds, and this should be available in this country. But unfortunately, the rules, if I'm not mistaken, of the laws of this country do not allow that to happen right now. But this can easily be amended by Parliament to allow that. But there has to be checks and balances. There have to be mechanisms to discipline this, and this is why I find that simply objecting because of the real problems of increasing money supply, simply objecting to that and warning about the threat of inflation and so on and so forth is not a solution to the crisis, as you have reminded us with your probing reminders. So it is a problem. I would also say that this threat of deflation, which Dr. Ferlito talks about he welcomes deflation. I don't welcome deflation. I welcome disinflation, but I do not welcome deflation. And this, I think, is where again we have a bit of a difference. But I think on the question of central bank independence, this is really secondary to our discussion today. But what has central bank independence meant where it has become a reality? It has really meant independence of government, of the government of the day, but not independence of the financial sector. So it is the financial sector which is so responsible for the problems we face, and it's really the bifurcation between finance and the real economy, which is at the root of the problems which we face in the world arguably for the last few decades. And this I think is part of the problem, and why I do not wish for the power of finance to be enhanced by having so-called central bank independence. It's certainly not independence from financial markets. It's independence from the government of the day. That's all it is. And this was in Malaysia. There was a very interesting debate about maybe 16, 17 years ago between the report made by central bank, by Bank Negara on the one hand, and the report of the Securities Commission on the other, which was basically pushing very hard for a bigger role for securities markets and stock market and so on and so forth, which has been the problem in many of the countries in the world. The final point I would like to make, you reminded us of how Sweden has continued to go for herd immunity, but not in the way that Boris Johnson did before the Imperial College of London study came out in the middle of March. If I understand what is happening in Sweden, there are protections for the more vulnerable people. Although we often say that this virus does not discriminate on the basis of race, etc., it does discriminate against older people like you and I, Mr. Moderator. We have to, we might seem very self-interested, but I do think, there are differences in public policy, and that's why just doing something is not good enough. We have to do the right thing. It is understandable that it was good enough 8 months ago when this whole crisis began. But today, to just continue with more of the same, I'm afraid that's not good enough for me, and I suspect for most Malaysians.
Thank you. I'm going to come to you in a moment, Dr. Ferlito. There's a question, Professor Tan Sri Sharif Kasim, who I'm sure you know, former Secretary General of the Malaysian Treasury, would like to ask a question. So perhaps if he could unmute himself and speak and raise his question to the panelists. Tan Sri? There seems to be perhaps a technical issue.
Tan Sri, can you unmute yourself? I guess we can skip and move to the next question, and we come back to Tan Sri.
Okay.
Thank you.
Now, there's a question also from the audience about fiscal policy. Elaborate what a more effective fiscal policy should be that can target economic growth and not increase national debt and government guaranteed debts. What should be done? And I take that to be a question about longer term issues, what kind of fiscal system should be worked towards in Malaysia, because that's what presumably will determine the longer term economic growth. Do you have comments on that? Dr. Ferlito, you might want to comment on that, or also come back to some of the questions that we were talking about before.
Yeah, sure. Well, it was very, very interesting to listen to Professor Jomo, and obviously I don't want here to raise the old debate, Keynes versus Hayek, that will bring us probably too far, but I share actually a lot of his concerns, and I also believe that this budget is not responding properly to the size of the crisis that we are experiencing. This does not mean that I advocate for more spending, but probably for a different kind of intervention. But surely the point where I agree is that this budget, to put it in a simple way, doesn't move us from containment to recovery. It is going nowhere. It lacks a strategy. That is the impression that I have about the budget. Then looking at the long term, obviously, so for a moment, going beyond the argument of the day, so the crisis generated by the lockdowns after COVID-19, imagining a fiscal system for the future Malaysia, I in generally tend to prefer indirect taxation because I think that a point that is needed in this moment is nudging in favor of increasing saving. So again, looking in the long-term perspective, Malaysia has a problem of household debt, has a problem of spending, which is cannot be simply looked at as a problem of low income, but there is also a problem of mentality, of present-oriented mentality. This is an issue. But I think that the biggest step that Malaysia should be doing on fiscal system is enforcement. Malaysia has a huge problem of collecting tax. So tax are there, but the people that actually pay tax are very little. So before raising tax, before thinking about tax reform in terms of peculiar taxes, I think we should look at doing a better job on enforcement. And this is very crucial and difficult because enforcement need not to become punishment, so the way that discourage business, but a way in which there is a fairer contribution by businesses and people to the fiscal system of Malaysia, because now is a terribly unbalanced and not well managed.
Thank you. Dr. Jomo, you have comments on the fiscal structure and where it should, without getting into the details, obviously, because it's an extremely complex system, but in general.
Yes, thank you. First, I think most Malaysians presume that the tax structure, the tax system is progressive. The reality is that it has never been progressive, at least since the 1960s. My late friend Ismail Saleh showed this during the 60s and 70s, and the situation has actually become worse with the increase of the share of indirect taxation. So direct taxation was low from the colonial period for reasons you can guess, and indirect taxation has actually increased as a share of total taxation. And so the incidence of tax on the ordinary Malaysians has actually been regressive rather than progressive. So I think it's very important for us to recognize that. I agree with Dr. Ferlito that we should do much more in terms of the tax effort. The fact that we have multiple tax agencies, the Inland Revenue Board on the one hand, and the Customs Department being in charge of consumption taxes, to me, just doesn't make sense. We have the possibility of actually centralizing a great deal of information, including tax information, and you would have much less evasion if the information was centralized in one single tax authority. So I completely agree with Dr. Ferlito that we have to be much, much more serious in terms of taxation. And the unfortunate thing is that this government and the last government has taken upon itself to make sweetheart deals through direct negotiations with particular companies instead of introducing a consistent, let us say, windfall taxes. So, for example, one of the biggest culprits for the latest cluster of COVID-19 is actually one of these companies which will contribute some money to the government, but actually there will not be any systematic taxation on those grounds. So I think we need far more regularization on that front. As far as where growth is going to come from, which is, I suspect, the intent of the questioner. I have, for long, my colleagues and I have been advocating at least 3 areas. One is the whole area of producing more food, not rice, more food, which is much more nutritious and food which is much safer, meaning rid of toxic agrochemicals, rid of antibiotics, and so on and so forth. The other areas which are related are the potential for greater production of renewable energy, not only for Malaysian consumption, but also well beyond. We are already the single largest exporter of photovoltaic solar panels to the United States. We are in a position to be the same for Europe, and so on and so forth. Yet not a single Malaysian company is involved. This is where GLCs should be involved, should be taking the lead. Likewise with the potential for palm oil-based biodiesel. Europe opted for biodiesel in 2006. And the potential is tremendous. But we have not even had the effort which, for example, Indonesia has made to try to promote palm oil-based biodiesel. So these are just areas which would affect a lot of people. There's tremendous employment implications of such positions, and they are already fairly close to being commercially viable and far more urgent as a focus for investments rather than thinking in terms of beginning R&D in new areas and so on and so forth, which to me is a very, very which is important to do, but we should take far to bear fruit. Thank you.
Thank you. The Asia School of Business is very much involved in trying to promote entrepreneurship in general and teach entrepreneurship. If I may ask you, both of you are of a deep knowledge of Malaysia, deep knowledge of the private sector. Is Malaysia a sort of positive nation for entrepreneurs to thrive? Are there difficulties for being an entrepreneur in this country? In which case, would that be an area where sort of changes in policy might help?
Well, if you allow me, as I have a direct experience, I've been running multinational companies for 10 years now here in Malaysia. So obviously the perfect country does not exist. So what we should do is probably look at Malaysia in relative terms. And so far, honestly, Malaysia has scored pretty well as a place to run business when compared in the regional context. So if, as it happened, if I was asked from some foreign entrepreneur where to set a regional hub, surely I will suggest Malaysia. Unfortunately, things are changing, and certain policies that have been implemented or announced during the last months are putting Malaysia in a different direction. What was announced, in example, on expatriates, the limit, the new freezing of hiring foreign workers, these are limitations. If I had to spot an area where it's difficult for entrepreneurs to deal, is the banking system. The banking system looks probably not up to the pace of the institutional framework as a whole. Is easier in Malaysia to incorporate a company than opening a bank account, while incorporating a company can take 3 days. To open a bank account can take 3 months. Okay, so there is a huge problem with banking in supporting businesses. Also, the fact that you can't have, in example, a corporate credit card for 2 years. You have to have 2 years of audited balance sheet to have a corporate credit card. So you can't give to your staff any credit card from the company for the first 2 years of activity. This is obviously limiting if you have people that travel for business and this kind of things. So in general, Malaysia scored well. It's a good place. What probably, if I can expand a bit the focus, where Malaysia can improve is not simply in attracting entrepreneurship, but in nurturing entrepreneurship. So not simply the framework that allow business to be set up and run, but the framework that allow entrepreneurship from this perspective, from the mind perspective, to emerge. I think on this perspective, my thought is quite heterodox. What we need in this perspective is an education reform that rebalance the relationship between humanities and sciences. The educational system is totally unbalanced towards science. I have a kid in school, so I see how humanities are taught, and it is a disaster. And the lack of humanistic knowledge, so the lack of confidence with literature, with philosophy, with geography, with history, creates people, impede people to develop that critical perspective that is a basic to create entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship is trying to face old problems or new problems in different ways, from different angles. And in order to have people that respond to this challenge, so potential entrepreneurs, you don't need only the institutional framework, you need also a mindset. That mindset needs humanities. This is a long-term reform, and I think is a very much needed reform in this country if we want to nurture domestic entrepreneurship.
Dr. Jomo, you have been involved in this business of both education and policy for economic development. Any thoughts on these sorts of issues?
To be quite honest, I have not thought very seriously about how to promote entrepreneurship. I have been concerned about the problems which are faced by small and micro enterprises. But the relationship between helping small and micro enterprises become viable and graduating into becoming medium-sized enterprises is not a straightforward one. It is a very complicated one. And the difficulties my friends who became engineers and started engineering firms. There are actually over 1,000 engineering firms in the Klang Valley alone, they have great difficulties. And unfortunately, although we have a proliferation of agencies, of well-meaning people in many of these agencies, it is not clear to me that these agencies have been very effective in supporting the broad range of enterprises needed. But I am very concerned about the right now, especially in the face of COVID-19, what is happening to the smallest enterprises who still account for a significant share of the Malaysian population.
What is, do you see a risk as a result of the current pandemic, lockdowns of partly a lockdown of schools, and you mentioned earlier, Dr. Jomo, that some school children don't have access to internet and therefore cannot follow instruction online to the extent that has to be done. What do you think about the long-term consequences of that for Malaysia generally, but for maybe income inequality, because obviously the lower strata of society are the ones that are suffering from that particular problem more than the higher income people who can afford other types of education and learning mechanisms?
Thank you. Again, it's a question which troubles me, but which I don't have very firm and strong conclusions about. Obviously, over 90% of children without the basic facilities for internet access, for meaningful internet access, are going to be significantly deprived of facilities. But there are also a whole range of ancillary problems relating to the fact that the whole routine of schooling and so on has been disrupted. And I would agree completely with Dr. Ferlito that the emphasis in Malaysian education, I think, is rather skewed in ways which are not very healthy. The need for a broad appreciation for the humanities is sorely missing. There is a fetish almost with science education, but the relationship between science and technology is very poorly thought through, and there's a fetish with certain types of products. How many papers you get published in journals, and so on and so forth. Rather than your ability to communicate with your others. And I remember some years ago that there was a survey done of social science journals, and it was found that the average number of readers, other than the assigned reader, was only less than 4. So I mean, we are in a self-referencing kind of framework, which is not terribly good, and almost 30% of well over a quarter of the population it now achieves tertiary education. But even at an earlier level, I think we don't have the kind of balance which is desperately needed. And this is one area where I think we have a great deal to not only from the Scandinavians but also from your neighbors, the Finns, who with relatively little time spent in school. But with tremendous results. But it means taking primary school education seriously. It means taking preschool activities seriously. It means thinking through the whole process of education as increasing a lifetime education. And of course, there is this other challenge, the other related challenge of the future nature of work. What was work going to be like as we are going to be increasingly displaced by automation, by mechanization and digitization? What all this implies is something which, I must admit, I've not thought through seriously enough. My colleagues have much more to say about this than I do, and I have a lot to learn about this.
Thank you. Dr. Ferlito, we're getting towards the end of the allotted time, so and we have really covered a lot of ground, starting with MMT and central bank monetary policy into fiscal policy and educational policy. So we've almost solved all the problems of the Malaysian economy. But any parting thoughts that you would like to convey?
Well, on the last point, this last point is related, on the consequences on children, and I look actually not only at have children in underprivileged families, but there is an issue that covers everybody, this disruption. I don't believe in online learning. I'm I was about to withdraw my kid from school, but I let him do an online school because it's the only way that he can see his friends and talk to his friends online. My condominium doesn't allow visitors, so my kid has been basically locked in the house for almost 1 year, not seeing our kids. So we are faced a big issue if this situation is prolonged in terms of the social attitude of the future generations, because being deprived of social contacts for so long will create social difficulties in kids. And this is a problem, of course, it's a broad problem, but it's a problem also for the economy, because people that are not able to interact with reality, to have social interaction, so seeing problems beyond the screen, they will not able to do anything good for the country. So the disruption on education needs to be seen really, really from a broad perspective that is going to affect the future of our country, because it affects the social mindset of our kids.
Thank you. I think we have only 3 minutes left, and I won't try to. First of all, I won't try to summarize the discussion. It's been extremely rich and very interesting. I think all the participants will take away from the discussion what it's a personal sort of appreciation of what has been said. I certainly have enjoyed listening to both of you, and thank you very much for your insights. I'd like to perhaps end on 2 things. One is an advertisement for a seminar that a webinar, sorry, it's going to be online, but tomorrow on the topic of monetization, and it's at the Asia School of Business, asb.edu.my. If you're interested, you can sign up. And it's a professor from MIT who is going to speak on that issue related to not so much of MMT itself, but it's more about monetization of fiscal policy and so on. Secondly, and lastly, I'd like to just end by saying that personally, I think the Malaysian authorities have done quite a good job on the question of trying to limit the effects of the pandemic and the spread of it. Thinking about where our son is living in California, in the United States, it's a total disaster. In Europe, it's difficult and going through several waves. And here in Malaysia, we get very upset when there are 2,000 cases, new cases. And of course, we should get upset. But I think personally, I think that it's been well handled. And I'm happy for that, since Dr. Jomo reminded me I'm in a particularly vulnerable age group. But with that, let me again thank you very much for your insights, for participating in this discussion. And let me end by turning it over to our friends, the organizers. I saw briefly our MC.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
So over to you for the final words.
Tonight for such a fruitful discussion, and to the audience who stick with us till the end, thank you. So tomorrow we will publish the summary of this discussion. So yeah, stay tuned for that. And thank you so much, and stay safe, everyone. Yeah.
Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Ciao.
Good night. Thank you.